Some men come home from the cold carrying something they cannot name. Medicine Lake sits in the northeastern corner of Montana, roughly 30 miles from the Canadian border, in a stretch of prairie so flat and featureless that early settlers described it as land that forgot to become something. The lake itself is shallow, officially no deeper than 25 feet, and spreads across more than 8,000 acres of protected wetland within the Medicine Lake National Wildlife Refuge. In summer, it hosts one of the largest nesting colonies of American white pelicans in the northern Great Plains. In winter, it becomes something else entirely, a vast white silence, broken only by wind and the occasional groan of shifting ice. The region belongs to Sheridan County, one of the least populated areas in the continental United States. The nearest town of any size is Plentywood, about 40 miles to the northeast. Wolf Point lies further south along the Missouri River and serves as the primary community of the Fort Peck Indian Reservation. The people who live here are accustomed to isolation. They understand that winter in this part of Montana is not a season, but a condition, something to be endured, respected, and occasionally feared. The Assiniboine and Sioux peoples who have inhabited this land for centuries refer to the lake by several names, most of which do not translate cleanly into English. One phrase, recorded by an ethnographer in 1923, roughly means, "the water that holds what should not be held." Elders have long discouraged camping on the ice after dark, though the reasons given vary and are rarely discussed with outsiders. By the 1980s, Medicine Lake had become a modest destination for ice fishing, particularly among residents of the surrounding towns who knew the waters well. The lake freezes early and thick, and the northern pike beneath the surface grow large in the mineral-rich shallows. It was not unusual for small groups to set up overnight camps during the coldest months, drilling holes and tending lines through the long darkness. On the evening of January 14, 1987, 3 men from Wolf Point drove the 60 miles north to Medicine Lake for a planned overnight fishing trip. Their names were Russell Krantz, 41, a mechanic who had fished the lake since childhood; Dennis Sorensen, 38, a postal worker originally from Williston, North Dakota; and Michael Brings Plenty, 29, a construction laborer and Krantz's brother-in-law. All 3 were experienced outdoorsmen. All 3 had camped on the ice before. They arrived at the lake around 4 in the afternoon and set up a small canvas shelter near the center of the frozen surface, approximately 1 mile from the eastern shore. The temperature that night dropped to 31 degrees below zero. The men had brought adequate supplies: a propane heater, sleeping bags rated for extreme cold, and enough food for 2 days. By their own account, they drilled 4 holes, caught several pike, and settled in for the night around 9. What happened between 9 p.m. and sunrise remains unclear. The men were found the following morning by a refuge maintenance worker named Terrence Belcourt, who noticed their vehicle still parked at the access road and drove out onto the ice to check on them. He discovered all 3 men sitting outside their shelter in the snow, without coats, staring at the ice. The temperature at that hour was still well below zero. None of them responded to Belcourt's voice. According to the incident report filed with the Sheridan County Sheriff's Office, the men were transported to Trinity Hospital in Wolf Point, where they were treated for moderate hypothermia. Physically, they recovered within 48 hours. But their behavior in the days that followed prompted a second report, this one filed by a physician named Dr. Eleanor Vasquez. Russell Krantz did not recognize his wife when she arrived at the hospital. He stared at her for nearly 2 minutes before asking, "Are you the one who's supposed to take me somewhere?" Dennis Sorensen refused to speak in complete sentences for 3 days, responding to questions with single words or fragmented phrases. Michael Brings Plenty became agitated whenever anyone mentioned the lake and reportedly asked a nurse if she could hear the woman counting. The phrase appeared in all 3 men's accounts. though they were interviewed separately and had no opportunity to coordinate their stories. Each described hearing a voice beneath the ice, a woman's voice, calm and measured, counting backward. When asked from what number, none of them could answer coherently. Sorensen said, "It wasn't a number we have." Brings Plenty said, "The counting started before numbers." Krantz simply shook his head and asked to be left alone. Dr. Vasquez noted in her report that the men displayed symptoms consistent with acute psychological dissociation, though the shared nature of the reported experience does not fit any recognized diagnostic model. She recommended follow-up psychiatric evaluation. None of the three men attended. A former neighbor of Russell Krantz, a woman named Patricia Dumas, later recalled the weeks following the incident. Russ was different after that, quieter. He'd stop mid-sentence sometimes and just look at you like he was trying to remember who you were. His wife told me he wouldn't sleep in the bedroom anymore, said he could hear something through the floor. Dennis Sorensen's sister, Ingrid, described a similar change. Denny used to be the funny one in the family, always joking, always the first to laugh. After that trip, he barely spoke. He moved to Arizona that summer, just packed up and left. Wouldn't say why. We didn't push. Michael Brings Plenty remained in Wolf Point, but withdrew from most of his former social circles. A co-worker at the construction company where he worked, a man named Leonard Dawson, said, "Mike wouldn't talk about it, ever. One time I asked him what happened out there, and he looked at me like I just said something obscene. He said, 'Some things don't come up through the ice. Some things go down.' That's all he ever said about it." Local Assiniboine elder Franklin Redstone, now deceased, spoke briefly about the incident to a reporter from the Great Falls Tribune in 1992. "That lake holds things," he said. "Not spirits, not ghosts, something older. The water remembers what it's shown, and sometimes it shows you back." The Sheridan County Sheriff's Office classified the incident as exposure-related disorientation. No further investigation was conducted. The refuge logbook from that January has a single entry dated the 15th, which reads, "3 fishermen recovered. No damage to property. Weather conditions noted as severe." Attempts to obtain the full hospital records from Trinity Hospital have been unsuccessful. In 2004, a researcher affiliated with the University of Montana submitted a Freedom of Information request for all documentation related to the incident. The request was denied on the basis that the records no longer exist in retrievable form. Dr. Eleanor Vasquez left her position at Trinity Hospital in late 1987 and relocated to Oregon. She did not respond to interview requests before her death in 2015. According to colleagues, she never spoke about the case publicly, though one former nurse, who asked not to be named, recalled Vasquez saying, "I've treated frostbite. I've treated hypothermia. I've never treated 3 men who forgot how to be themselves." Interestingly, a sonar survey conducted at Medicine Lake in 1994 recorded a maximum depth of 25 feet, consistent with official records. But a 1962 Army Corps of Engineers report, briefly referenced in a regional geological index, listed a central anomaly in the lake bed measuring over 340 feet. That report has since been removed from public archives. Russell Krantz died in 2001 of a stroke. Dennis Sorensen passed away in 2012 in a care facility in Phoenix, where he had lived for nearly a decade, having been diagnosed with early-onset dementia in his mid-50s. Michael Brings Plenty is still alive, now in his late 60s, living on the reservation. He has never returned to Medicine Lake. In 2019, a documentary crew from Missoula attempted to interview Brings Plenty for a film about unexplained incidents in Montana's wildlife refuges. He declined, but his daughter, who asked to remain anonymous, shared one detail she said her father had mentioned only once, years earlier. He told me he still hears her sometimes, not in his ears, somewhere deeper. He said the counting never stopped. It just moved inside. Medicine Lake freezes every winter. The pelicans return every spring. The refuge remains open to visitors, and ice fishing is still permitted during designated months. But locals say there's one unwritten rule everyone follows. No one camps on the ice after dark. Not anymore. And if you ask them why, most of them won't answer. A few will simply say, because some people come back wrong. What they heard that night beneath the ice, if they heard anything at all, has never been explained. And all three men, in their own ways, carried that silence with them for the rest of their lives. Some carried it further than others. Some lakes have bottoms, others only have depths that refuse to be measured. Medicine Lake spreads across more than 8,000 acres of protected wetland in Sheridan County, Montana, roughly 30 miles south of the Canadian border. On maps, it appears as a shallow, wind-scoured basin, the remnant of ancient glacial melt, surrounded by prairie that stretches unbroken to every horizon. The region is classified as semi-arid, receiving less than 14 inches of precipitation annually, and the lake itself fluctuates dramatically with the seasons, sometimes shrinking to half its surface area during dry summers. The Medicine Lake National Wildlife Refuge was established in 1935, primarily to protect migratory bird populations along the Central Flyway. Today, it hosts one of the largest breeding colonies of American white pelicans in North America, along with hundreds of other species that stop here during their continental journeys. For most visitors, the lake represents nothing more than a quiet stretch of protected wilderness, flat, remote, and unremarkable. But the lake's depth has never been a settled question. Official records from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service list Medicine Lake's maximum depth at approximately 25 feet, with an average depth closer to 6. These figures appear in visitor brochures, ecological assessments, and federal land management documents. They have remained consistent for decades. What those records do not mention is the survey conducted in the summer of 1962. That July, a 3-person team from the Army Corps of Engineers arrived at Medicine Lake as part of a broader hydrological assessment of northeastern Montana's water resources. The project was routine, a post-war effort to catalog lakes, reservoirs, and aquifers for agricultural planning. The team was led by a civil engineer named Raymond Ostrowski, accompanied by a geologist named Francis Lindquist and a surveying technician named Harold Moberg. According to documents later obtained through a regional archives request, the team spent 4 days mapping the lake's bathymetry using weighted sounding lines and early sonar equipment. Their initial readings matched expectations, shallow, silty, and relatively uniform. But on the 3rd day, while surveying a section near the lake's geographic center, their equipment returned an anomalous reading. The sonar registered a depth of 342 feet. Ostrowski ordered the measurement repeated. The second reading returned 351 feet. The third returned nothing at all. The signal simply disappeared, as though the water had swallowed it. Lindquist, the geologist, later wrote in a personal letter to a colleague at the University of Minnesota that the readings were physically impossible given the surrounding geology. The lake sits in a prairie pothole region, she noted, where glacial action created thousands of shallow depressions, none deeper than 40 feet. A 300-foot anomaly would require either a volcanic tube, a collapsed caverns, or something our current models do not account for. The team attempted to verify the readings with a weighted line the following morning. According to Moberg's handwritten field notes recovered decades later from an estate sale in Bismarck, the line descended for over 200 feet before the weight stopped pulling. When they retrieved it, the final 30 feet of cord had been severed cleanly, as though cut with a blade. The weight was never recovered. The survey was concluded early. The final report, submitted to the Corps of Engineers Regional Office in Omaha, included a single reference to the anomaly. Central Basin readings inconclusive. Recommend follow-up survey pending equipment review. No follow-up was ever scheduled. Lindquist requested reassignment to a project in Colorado 3 weeks later. Moberg left the Corps entirely by the end of the year. Ostrowski remained with the agency until his retirement in 1981, but never returned to Montana. When researchers from Montana State University conducted a new sonar survey of Medicine Lake in 1994, their equipment recorded a uniform depth of 24 feet across the entire basin. No anomaly was detected. The 1962 report was not referenced in their findings because, according to federal archives, the report no longer existed. A second survey in 2011, conducted by a private firm contracted by the Fish and Wildlife Service, returned similar results. The deepest point measured was 26 feet, located near the northwestern shore. The team's lead technician, a man named Curtis Jankowski, described the lake as hydrologically unremarkable. But Jankowski later told a journalist from the Billings Gazette something he had not included in his official report. "We had one weird moment out there," he said. "Middle of the lake, calm day, no wind. The sonar just stopped returning data. Screen went blank for maybe 15 seconds. When it came back, everything was normal. I figured it was a glitch." He paused before adding, "The thing that bothered me was the timestamp. When I checked the log later, those 15 seconds weren't recorded. It was like they didn't happen." Local residents of Sheridan County have their own theories about the lake, most of which they share only reluctantly. A rancher named Eugene Halverson, whose family has lived near the refuge since the 1920s, recalled a story his father told him as a child. Dad said the old-timers used to call that part of the lake the soft spot. Said if you rode out there on a still day, you could feel the water pulling, not like a current, like a weight underneath. An Assiniboine elder named Dolores Ironcloud, interviewed in 2008 for a regional oral history project, offered a less specific but more unsettling perspective. "There are places where the earth isn't finished," she said. "Medicine Lake is one of them. The water there doesn't sit on rock. It sits on something else, something that still moves." Efforts to locate the original 1962 report have repeatedly failed. In 2003, a researcher named Marianne Kowalski submitted a Freedom of Information Act request to the Army Corps of Engineers seeking all documentation related to the Medicine Lake Hydrological Survey. The response, received 11 months later, stated that the records had been transferred to an auxiliary archive pending review and were not available for public access at this time. Kowalski filed an appeal. It was denied. She submitted a second request in 2006. This time through a different agency. That request was returned with a single-page response indicating that the records could not be located. In 2015, a digitized index of Cold War-era federal surveys briefly appeared on a government database before being removed. A screenshot, preserved by an independent researcher, listed a file titled Medicine Lake Bathymetric Survey, July 1962, inconclusive. The file itself was marked as restricted geological sensitivity. No explanation for that classification has ever been provided. The question of what lies beneath Medicine Lake remains officially unanswered. The Fish and Wildlife Service maintains that the lake is shallow, stable, and well documented. The Army Corps of Engineers has no comment on historical surveys, and the town of Medicine Lake, Montana, population 246, continues to exist in quiet proximity to a body of water that may or may not contain something 300 feet below its surface. Raymond Ostrovsky died in 1997. His personal papers were donated to a historical society in Nebraska, but the collection contains no reference to his time in Montana. Francis Lindquist passed away in 2004 in a retirement community in Boulder. Harold Moberg's whereabouts after 1963 are unknown. Only Moberg's field notes survive, those few handwritten pages recovered from a cardboard box in North Dakota, sold for $12 at an estate auction. On the final page, beneath the entry describing the severed sounding line, Moberg had written a single question, underlined twice. What cut it? The question was never answered, and according to every official survey conducted since, there is nothing in Medicine Lake deep enough to require one. 25 feet. That is the number on record. But records, as any archivist will tell you, are only as complete as the institutions that keep them. And some institutions, it seems, prefer not to keep certain things at all. The lake remains. The depth remains in dispute. And somewhere in a federal archive, or perhaps nowhere at all, a 60-year-old report sits in a file marked restricted, describing a hole in the earth that no one has been able to find since, or perhaps no one has been allowed to look. Birds do not follow people. That is not what birds do. Medicine Lake National Wildlife Refuge encompasses 31,000 acres of protected wetland in the far northeastern corner of Montana, approximately 30 miles from the Canadian border. The landscape is defined by absence, no trees to speak of, no significant elevation changes, no landmarks visible from the flat expanse of shortgrass prairie that surrounds the lake on all sides. The refuge was established in 1935 to protect migratory waterfowl along the Central Flyway, and today it serves as a critical stopover for hundreds of bird species traveling between Canada and the Gulf of Mexico. The lake itself is shallow, rarely exceeding 25 feet at its deepest point, and spreads irregularly across more than 8,000 surface acres. Its water level fluctuates dramatically with seasonal rainfall, sometimes retreating to expose hundreds of acres of mudflat during dry summers. The nearest town is Plentywood, 40 miles northeast. The nearest city of any size is Williston, North Dakota, nearly 90 miles to the east. Among the species that nest at Medicine Lake, none is more prominent than the American white pelican. The refuge hosts one of the largest breeding colonies in North America. At peak season, more than 10,000 birds occupy the islands and shorelines, their white bodies visible for miles against the brown prairie grass. Unlike their coastal relatives, these pelicans do not dive. They float in coordinated groups, dipping their massive bills in unison to scoop fish from the shallows. They are, by all accounts, unremarkable in their behavior. Colonial nesters, cooperative feeders, sensitive to human disturbance. Except, according to refuge records, when they are not. The first documented incident occurred in August of 1978. A birdwatcher from Minneapolis named Gerald Lindquist was hiking alone along the northern perimeter of the lake, photographing shorebirds when he noticed a group of approximately 12 white pelicans floating roughly 50 yards offshore. What drew his attention was not their presence, but their stillness. They were not feeding. They were not preening. They were motionless on the water, their heads turned uniformly toward the shore, toward him. Lindquist continued walking. The pelicans did not move, but their heads tracked his movement, all 12 of them, rotating in unison as he passed. He later described the experience in a letter to the refuge office, which was preserved in the visitor feedback archives. "I have been watching birds for 31 years," he wrote. "I have never seen coordinated attention like this. It was not curiosity. It was observation." The refuge ranger who received the letter, a man named Douglas Brandt, noted in the logbook that the location Lindquist described did not correspond to any established trail or observation point. It was, according to Brandt's notation, an unmarked section of northern shore, approximately 1.3 miles west of the Bridgerman Point Access Road. This location would appear again in 13 subsequent reports over the next 4 decades. In June of 1985, a husband and wife from Great Falls, Thomas and June Korhonen, visited the refuge to photograph nesting sites. While walking near the northern shore, June noticed a group of pelicans behaving strangely. According to the written account she submitted to the refuge office, the birds were floating in a loose formation approximately 40 yards from shore, and their heads were all pointed in the same direction. When she raised her camera, the birds did not startle or disperse. They remained still. "It wasn't until I moved that I realized they were watching me," she wrote. "I walked left. The heads followed. I walked right. They followed again. I stopped. They stopped. My husband didn't see it. He was looking elsewhere, but I know what I saw." The Korhonens cut their visit short and did not return. In 1991, a graduate student in ornithology named Samuel Achebe was conducting fieldwork at the refuge when he observed a similar phenomenon. His notes, later included in an unpublished appendix to his thesis, described a group of 9 pelicans that displayed tracking behavior inconsistent with any known predator response. He attempted to photograph the birds, but his camera malfunctioned. The batteries, which he had replaced that morning, were completely drained. Achebe returned to the same location 3 days later. The birds were gone. But when he reviewed his field notes, he discovered something that unsettled him. The coordinates he had recorded for the sighting matched, almost exactly, the location described in the 1978 incident report, a report he had never seen. He brought this to the attention of his faculty advisor at the University of Montana. The advisor dismissed it as coincidence and recommended he focus on more productive lines of inquiry. Achebe completed his degree but did not pursue a career in ornithology. He now works as a high school biology teacher in Bozeman. He declined to be interviewed for this account. Between 1978 and 2019, the Medicine Lake Refuge logbook contains 14 entries describing similar incidents, all involving white pelicans, all involving the same approximate location on the northern shore, and all involving visitors who were photographing the area at the time of the encounter. In 2003, a refuge biologist named Dr. Irene Vasquez was asked to review the accumulated reports and provide a scientific assessment. Her memo, obtained through a Freedom of Information request in 2016, concluded that the observed behavior was not consistent with established pelican ethology, but stopped short of offering an alternative explanation. "Colonial water birds do not track individual humans," she wrote. "They respond to perceived threats with alarm calls and dispersal, not coordinated stillness." The pattern described in these reports suggests either observational error or an environmental stimulus we have not yet identified. When asked to elaborate on what that stimulus might be, Vasquez declined. Her memo was not included in any published refuge assessment. Curiously, the section of Northern Shore referenced in all 14 incidents does not appear on any official refuge trail map. Satellite imagery shows the area as a narrow strip of mudflat bordered by dense cattail marsh, accessible but not promoted to visitors. The refuge's public access guide lists 12 designated observation points. This location is not among them. A retired ranger named Wallace Drummond, who worked at Medicine Lake from 1982 to 2007, confirmed in a 2014 interview that the area was deliberately excluded from visitor materials. "We didn't want people going out there," he said. "The footing is unstable. The marsh can be disorienting." And there were complaints. When pressed on the nature of those complaints, Drummond hesitated. People said the birds made them uncomfortable. That's not something you put in a brochure." He added, almost as an afterthought, that the unmarked section of shore had an informal name among refuge staff. They called it the Gallery. No one could explain why. In 2017, a wildlife photographer named Marjorie Boone visited Medicine Lake on assignment for a regional nature magazine. She was not aware of the previous reports. She had never heard of the Gallery, but when she returned to her hotel that evening and reviewed her photographs, she noticed something she had not seen in the field. In the background of a landscape shot, barely visible against the water, was a line of white shapes, pelicans, floating in a row, their heads turned toward the camera. She had not photographed them intentionally. She had not even seen them at the time. "They were watching me," she said later, "and I didn't know." The 14 incidents remain unexplained. No formal study has been conducted. The refuge continues to operate as it always has, welcoming thousands of visitors each year to observe one of the largest pelican colonies on the continent. Most of those visitors stay on the designated trails. Most of them see nothing unusual, but occasionally someone wanders north. Someone raises a camera, and somewhere on the water a row of white birds goes still. They do not flee. They do not call. They only watch. There are sounds that should not exist in shallow water. Medicine Lake lies in the northeastern corner of Montana, a sprawling wetland refuge approximately 30 miles from the Canadian border. The lake is shallow, officially no deeper than 25 feet, and spreads across more than 8,000 acres of protected habitat within the Medicine Lake National Wildlife Refuge. The surrounding terrain is prairie, flat, and treeless, offering no natural barriers to the wind that sweeps across the region in every season. Homestead Bay is a smaller inlet on the lake's western edge, named for the abandoned farmsteads that once dotted the area before the refuge was established in 1935. The bay is quieter than the main body of the lake, sheltered slightly by low marsh vegetation and accessible only by a single unpaved road that floods in wet years. It is not a popular destination. Most visitors to the refuge never see it. The area has a history, though not one that appears in official brochures. Local ranchers have long referred to Homestead Bay as the quiet part, not because it is peaceful, but because sounds there seem to behave differently. Voices do not carry the way they should. Echoes arrive late or not at all. A hunter from Plentywood, interviewed in 1997 for a regional oral history project, described firing a shotgun near the bay and hearing the report return to him like it had traveled somewhere else first. The Assiniboine people, whose ancestral lands include this region, have their own name for the bay. Translated loosely, it means the place where the water listens. In May of 2003, a graduate student named Christian Odegaard arrived at Medicine Lake to conduct fieldwork for his doctoral thesis at the University of Montana. His research focused on bioacoustics, specifically the underwater sounds produced by fish populations in shallow prairie lakes. It was not glamorous work. It involved long hours of recording equipment calibration, data logging, and solitary monitoring in remote locations. Odegaard chose Homestead Bay for its relative isolation and its documented populations of northern pike and yellow perch. On May 14th, he deployed a hydrophone, an underwater microphone, approximately 200 yards from the western shore, anchored at a depth of 12 feet. The equipment was standard for the field, a ceramic transducer connected to a digital recorder capable of capturing frequencies between 20 and 20,000 hertz. For the first 3 days, the recordings were unremarkable. Fish activity, water movement, the occasional passage of a boat motor in the distance. Odegaard logged the data and continued his work. On the evening of May 17th, he retrieved a recording that would change the course of his academic career, and then end it. The file was 47 minutes long, captured between 2:14 and 3:01 in the morning. It began with the ambient sounds Odegor had come to expect. The low hum of water pressure, the faint clicks of biological activity. But at approximately the 6-minute mark, a new sound emerged. It was rhythmic, pulsing, low in frequency, hovering around 18 hertz, just at the edge of human hearing. The pulses came in irregular intervals, sometimes clustered, sometimes separated by several seconds of silence. They did not match any known biological signature in Odegord's reference database. He ran a spectrographic analysis. The results were troubling. When the audio was time-stretched, slowed by a factor of 8, the pulses took on a different character. They were not random. They had structure, intonation, pauses that resembled breath. According to Odegord's notes, later obtained by a journalist who reviewed his archived thesis materials, the slowed audio exhibited cadence patterns consistent with human speech. He could not identify a language. He could not isolate words, but the rhythm was unmistakable, rising and falling in patterns that suggested syntax, emphasis, meaning. He told no one, not at first. Odegord spent the following week attempting to replicate the recording. He moved the hydrophone to different locations. He recorded at the same time each night. He captured nothing but silence. On May 26th, he confided in a fellow graduate student named Laura Mickelson. She listened to the original recording at his apartment in Missoula. According to an email she sent to a friend that evening, later shared anonymously with a podcast investigating the incident, she described the experience as profoundly disquieting. It sounded like someone talking very slowly from very far away, she wrote, like a voice coming through mud. Chris looked scared. I don't think I've ever seen him like that. Mickelson encouraged Odegord to share the recording with his thesis advisor, Dr. Harold Ingerslev. He did so on June 2nd. The meeting lasted less than 15 minutes. Ingerslev's response was not what Odegord expected. According to a statement Odegord gave years later to an independent researcher, his only public comment on the matter, the professor listened to approximately 2 minutes of the recording, asked where it had been captured, and then told Odegord to delete it. He didn't explain, Odegord said. He just said, "This isn't part of your research. Remove it from your files." When I asked why, he said, "Because I'm telling you to." Odegord did not delete the recording, but he also did not include it in his thesis. He completed his fieldwork, submitted his dissertation on the acoustic behavior of northern pike, and graduated in 2004. His thesis makes no mention of the May 17th recording. Neither does any official document from the University of Montana. Dr. Ingerslev retired in 2008 and has declined all interview requests. Laura Mickelson left academia after completing her own degree and now works in environmental consulting in Seattle. She has not commented publicly on the incident. The recording itself has become something of a legend among acoustic researchers and paranormal enthusiasts alike, though its existence has never been officially confirmed. Odegord reportedly made a single backup copy on a compact disc, which he stored in a safe deposit box in Missoula. When a journalist attempted to obtain the disc in 2019 through a legal agreement with Odegord, the safe deposit box was found to be empty. The bank had no record of the contents being removed. Odegord himself transferred to a doctoral program in environmental policy at the University of British Columbia shortly after completing his Montana degree. He has not published any research related to bioacoustics since 2005. He does not respond to inquiries about Medicine Lake. What remains is speculation and fragments. A 1979 report from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service noted intermittent low-frequency anomalies detected by seismic equipment installed at the refuge headquarters approximately 4 miles from Homestead Bay. The report attributed the readings to geological settling and recommended no further investigation. The monitoring station was decommissioned in 1981. An Assiniboine elder named Rosalie Fourstar, interviewed in 2010 for a tribal history project, spoke obliquely about sounds heard near the western shore. "The water there talks," she said. "Not to us. To something else. My grandmother told me never to listen too closely. She said some voices are not meant for living ears." The bay remains accessible to visitors, though few make the effort. The road floods in spring, the mosquitoes are relentless in summer, and the quiet, that strange, heavy quiet, unsettles most people before they can articulate why. Christian Odegaard is now 51 years old. He lives in Vancouver, works as a policy analyst for a provincial environmental agency, and has not returned to Montana since 2004. In 2021, a podcaster managed to reach him by phone. The conversation lasted less than 3 minutes. When asked about the recording, Odegaard paused for a long moment before responding. "I heard something," he said. "I don't know what it was. I don't know if it was real. And I've spent 20 years trying not to think about it." He hung up before the interviewer could ask a follow-up question. The recording from Homestead Bay has never been released. It may no longer exist. But those who have heard descriptions of it, the slow, rhythmic pulses, the cadence that resembles speech, often ask the same question. If someone was speaking beneath the water, who were they speaking to? And more importantly, who was listening? She was standing in the water, but the water had not touched her. Medicine Lake occupies a shallow basin in Sheridan County, Montana, roughly 30 miles south of the Canadian border. The lake spreads across more than 8,000 acres of protected wetland, surrounded by prairie that offers no shelter from the wind or the eye. In summer, the refuge teems with migratory birds, pelicans, geese, ducks by the hundreds of thousands. In autumn, the land empties, the birds leave, the grasses turn brown, and the lake, already cold, begins its slow transformation into something harder. By October, Medicine Lake is not a place people visit willingly. The access roads turn to mud after the first rains. The temperatures drop below freezing most nights. The nearest significant town is Plentywood, 40 miles to the northeast, population roughly 2,000 in the early 1970s. Beyond that, there is little but grain elevators, isolated ranches, and miles of empty sky. The eastern shore of the lake is particularly desolate. No designated trails lead there. No facilities exist. The road that approaches it, County Road 12, ends at a weathered boat launch that sees use only during fishing season. After September, the area is effectively abandoned. It was here at approximately 3:15 in the morning on October 9, 1971, that a Sheridan County deputy named Vernon Ide discovered a woman standing alone in the lake. The woman was Margaret Enger, 34 years old, a fourth-grade teacher at Plentywood Elementary School. She lived alone in a small house on the south side of town. She had no history of mental illness, no record of substance abuse, and no known reason to be standing in freezing water in the middle of the night, 40 miles from her home. Deputy Ide had been driving the perimeter road as part of a routine patrol when his headlights caught movement near the shore. At first, he thought it was an animal, a deer perhaps, or a coyote come to drink. But as he approached, he realized it was a person, a woman, standing motionless in the water, facing the center of the lake, the water level reaching just above her navel. Ida called out to her. She did not respond. He waded in and guided her back to shore. She was conscious but unresponsive, her eyes open, her breathing steady. She did not resist. She did not speak. It was only when Ida helped her into the back of his patrol car that he noticed something wrong. Her coat was wet, her blouse was wet, but her skirt, her stockings, her shoes, everything below her waist was completely dry. He noted this in his incident report, filed the following morning with the Sheridan County Sheriff's Office. The report, later obtained through a public records request, includes the following observation. Subject's lower garment showed no evidence of water contact despite immersion to approximately 36 inches. Unable to explain. Subject, non-communicative. Margaret Enger was transported to the Sheridan County Hospital, where she was examined by a physician named Dr. Rolf Nygaard. His notes, preserved in the hospital's archived records, describe her as disoriented but physically unharmed. Her core body temperature was normal, unusual for someone who had been standing in near freezing water for an unknown length of time. Her clothing was tested for water resistance and found to be standard wool and cotton with no unusual properties. When asked how she had come to be at the lake, Enger could not answer. She had no memory of leaving her home. Her car, a 1966 Chevrolet Impala, was found parked at the boat launch, keys still in the ignition, engine cold. She had driven 40 miles in the middle of the night, walked into a freezing lake, and stood there until someone found her. And somehow, half of her had stayed dry. A neighbor of Margaret Enger, a retired postal worker named Doris Knutson, was among the first to visit her in the hospital. She looked like herself, Knutson recalled in an interview conducted in 1993 for a local history project. But she wasn't herself. She kept asking what day it was. She asked me if the children were safe. I told her it was Saturday, there was no school. She just nodded. But her eyes, they were looking at something I couldn't see. Deputy Ida, who passed away in 2004, gave a single interview about the incident in 1987 to a journalist writing a feature on unusual police reports in rural Montana. "I've pulled people out of lakes before," he said. "Drunks mostly. Suicides. You know what wet clothes look like. You know what cold does to a person. That woman wasn't wet where she should have been wet. And she wasn't cold when she should have been cold. I don't have an explanation. I just wrote down what I saw." Dr. Nygaard's medical notes include a brief addendum handwritten on the final page. No physiological explanation for observed anomalies. Referred for psychiatric evaluation. Patient cooperative but affect flat. Recommend observation. Margaret Enger was transferred to the Montana State Hospital in Warm Springs on October 15, 1971. She remained there for 7 months. The hospital records from her stay are sparse. Much of the documentation from that era has been lost or redacted under patient privacy laws enacted in subsequent decades. What remains suggests that Enger was treated for what was then termed acute dissociative episode, a diagnosis that encompassed a wide range of symptoms without offering a specific cause. She was discharged in May of 1972. She did not return to teaching. According to county records, Enger sold her house in Plentywood later that year and moved to Billings, where she lived quietly until her death in 2009. She never married. She never spoke publicly about the incident. A former colleague at Plentywood Elementary, a woman named Beverly Gunderson, remained in occasional contact with Enger through Christmas cards and rare phone calls. In a 2012 interview, Gunderson shared one detail that Enger had mentioned only once, years after the incident. "She told me she remembered one thing from that night," Gunderson said. "She remembered hearing someone calling her name, a woman's voice, coming from the water. She said she didn't walk into the lake. She said she was invited." Gunderson paused before adding, "She never told me what the voice said. I don't think she wanted to remember." The Sheridan County Sheriff's Office closed the case in late 1971, classifying it as a mental health incident with no criminal activity. The file contains Deputy Ida's original report, Dr. Nygaard's medical summary, and a single photograph of Enger's vehicle at the boat launch. It contains no explanation for the dry clothing. No follow-up investigation was conducted. The eastern shore of Medicine Lake remains as empty today as it was in 1971. The boat launch is still there, though the wood has rotted and the concrete has cracked. No signs mark the location. No memorial exists, but among longtime residents of Sheridan County, the story of Margaret Enger persists, passed down in fragments, told in low voices, never quite believed, and never quite forgotten. She was a schoolteacher. She lived alone. One night she drove 40 miles to a lake she had no reason to visit, walked into the water, and stood there until morning. And when they pulled her out, half of her was dry. No one knows why. No one knows how. And Margaret Enger, who lived another 37 years after that night, never offered an explanation. Perhaps she didn't have one. Or perhaps she simply chose not to share it. The lake is still there. The water still rises in spring and recedes in autumn. And somewhere beneath its surface, or perhaps just at its edge, something once called a woman's name. She answered, and part of her, it seems, never came back. When 50,000 birds stop calling at once, the silence is not an absence. It is a presence. Medicine Lake National Wildlife Refuge sprawls across 31,000 acres of protected wetland in Sheridan County, Montana, approximately 30 miles from the Canadian border. The refuge was established in 1935 as a sanctuary for migratory waterfowl along the Central Flyway, one of the 4 major bird migration routes in North America. Each autumn, the lake becomes a temporary home to staggering numbers of birds, snow geese, Canada geese, tundra swans, and dozens of duck species, passing through on their journey from the Canadian prairies to wintering grounds in the American South. At peak migration, typically in late October, the bird population at Medicine Lake can exceed 200,000 individuals. The sound is overwhelming. The collective honking, calling, and wing beating of that many birds creates a continuous wall of noise that can be heard from miles away. Longtime residents of Sheridan County describe autumn at the lake as living inside a radio stuck between stations, a constant, layered cacophony that becomes background noise for anyone who lives nearby. The refuge is managed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which maintains detailed records of bird populations, migration patterns, and environmental conditions. Rangers conduct daily surveys during peak season. Researchers from universities across the region visit regularly to study the congregations. The data stretches back decades, which is why the silences are so difficult to explain. The first documented incident occurred on October 17, 1959. A refuge ranger named Theodore Lindgren was conducting a morning census near the eastern shore when he noticed something strange. The birds had stopped calling, not gradually, not in response to a visible predator, but all at once, as though someone had pressed a mute button on the entire lake. Lindgren noted the time, 8:47 a.m. He stood motionless, watching. The geese floated on the water. The ducks drifted in loose formations. None of them moved. None of them made a sound. The silence lasted approximately 14 minutes. At 9:01, according to Lindgren's logbook, the noise resumed. Again, all at once, as though the birds had collectively decided the pause was over. No predator was observed. No aircraft had passed overhead. The weather was clear and calm. Lindgren filed a brief report with the refuge office, noting the incident as unexplained collective behavior. No follow-up investigation was conducted. The second incident occurred nearly 30 years later, on October 23, 1988. This time, multiple witnesses were present. A group of birdwatchers from the Audubon Society chapter in Billings had arrived at the refuge for a weekend excursion. Among them was a retired ornithologist named Dr. Astrid Henriksen, who had studied waterfowl behavior for more than 40 years. At approximately 2:15 in the afternoon, she and 11 other members of the group were positioned at an observation platform overlooking the main body of the lake when the birds fell silent. Henriksen later described the experience in a letter to a colleague at the University of Wyoming. It was not a gradual diminishment, she wrote. It was instantaneous. One moment the noise was deafening, the next, nothing. Absolute nothing. The birds did not fly, they did not scatter, they simply stopped. She checked her watch. The silence lasted 19 minutes. I have spent my career studying bird behavior, Henriksen wrote. I have never witnessed anything like this. The synchronization was impossible. There was no stimulus. There was no threat. And yet every bird on that lake, thousands upon thousands of them, stopped vocalizing at precisely the same moment. The third documented incident occurred on October 11, 2007. A wildlife photographer named Marcus Johansson was recording video footage of the migration for a documentary project when his audio equipment registered a sudden drop to near 0 decibels. He was positioned on the northern shore, approximately half a mile from the main congregation. The silence lasted 11 minutes. Johansson's footage, later reviewed by audio engineers, confirmed what he experienced. The ambient noise level dropped from approximately 85 decibels, comparable to a busy highway, to less than 15 decibels in under 2 seconds. The recording captured no transitional sound, no warning, just noise, then silence. It felt wrong, Johansson said in a 2012 interview with a regional magazine. Not quiet, wrong. Like the air had changed density, like something was pressing down on everything. I couldn't move. I don't mean I was scared. I mean I physically felt like I shouldn't move. And the birds felt it too. They were frozen. When the sound returned, Johansson said, it was like waking up from a dream you didn't know you were having. Local residents who have lived near the refuge for generations speak of the silences with a mixture of familiarity and unease. A rancher named Elmer Gustafson, whose family has worked land adjacent to the refuge since the 1920s, recalled hearing about similar incidents from his father and grandfather. The old-timers called it the listening, Gustafson said in a 2015 interview. They said it happened every few decades. The birds would go quiet, and you weren't supposed to make noise either. You were supposed to wait. My grandfather said if you spoke during the listening, the birds would know, and they'd remember. An Assiniboine elder named Lorraine Whitecalf, interviewed for a tribal oral history project in 2010, offered a different perspective. The lake listens, she said. Not always, but sometimes. When it listens, everything else has to be quiet. The birds know this. They've always known. White people think it's strange because they don't understand that some places have attention. Medicine Lake pays attention, and when it does, you feel it. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has no official explanation for the documented silences. The refuge's administrative records contain references to all 3 incidents, but no formal investigation was ever conducted. A 2009 internal memo, obtained through a Freedom of Information request, mentions the 1988 and 2007 incidents in a single paragraph, describing them as anomalous, synchronized behavior events, and noting that no environmental or biological cause has been identified. The memo recommends no further action. Dr. Patricia Sorensen, a behavioral ecologist at Montana State University, reviewed the available documentation in 2018 at the request of an independent researcher. Her assessment was cautious. Synchronized behavior in bird populations is well documented, she wrote. Starling murmurations, for example, involve rapid coordination among thousands of individuals, but those behaviors are typically responses to predators or environmental cues. What's described in these reports, simultaneous cessation of vocalization across multiple species with no apparent stimulus, does not fit any established model. She added a caveat. The absence of explanation is not evidence of anything supernatural. It simply means we don't have enough data. Attempts to gather more data have been limited. The refuge does not maintain continuous audio monitoring equipment. The silences, by their nature, are unpredictable, and those who have witnessed them often seem reluctant to discuss the experience in detail. Marcus Johansson, the photographer who recorded the 2007 incident, was asked in a follow-up interview whether he had returned to the refuge during migration season. He said he had not. "I've thought about it," he admitted, "but I don't want to be there when it happens again. I don't know why. I just don't." Theodore Lindgren's logbook from 1959 remains in the refuge archives. The entry for October 17th includes a final observation that has puzzled researchers who have examined it. "Birds resumed normal behavior at 9:01, he wrote. "No cause determined." Note: during the silence, I observed my own breathing had stopped. I did not notice until it started again. He underlined the last sentence twice. Medicine Lake continues to host one of the largest migratory bird gatherings on the continent. Each autumn, hundreds of thousands of birds descend on the refuge, filling the air with noise that can be heard for miles, and most years the noise continues uninterrupted. But 3 times in the past 66 years, in 1959, 1988, and 2007, the birds have fallen silent. All of them. All at once. No one knows why. No one knows when it will happen again. The only certainty is that it has happened before. And that when it does, the silence is not empty. It is full of something waiting to be heard. Buildings do not turn on their own, yet the photographs do not lie. Medicine Lake lies in the northeastern corner of Montana, a shallow expanse of wetland roughly 30 miles from the Canadian border. The lake spreads across more than 8,000 acres within the boundaries of the Medicine Lake National Wildlife Refuge, established in 1935. But long before federal protection arrived, the land surrounding the lake was homesteaded by families drawn to the region by promises of cheap land and the hope of agricultural prosperity. Most of those homesteads failed. The soil was marginal, the winters were brutal. The isolation proved too much for many settlers who abandoned their claims within a decade. By the 1920s, only a handful of families remained, their holdings scattered along the lake's perimeter like the last teeth in an old jaw. The western shore was particularly desolate. The terrain there slopes gradually toward the water, offering little shelter from the wind that sweeps across the prairie in every season. The nearest town, Plentywood, lies 40 miles to the northeast. In the early 20th century, that distance meant something. It meant solitude. It meant self-reliance. And for some, it meant being forgotten. The Thorvaldsen family was not forgotten, not entirely. They left behind a cabin. Gunnar Thorvaldsen emigrated from Norway in 1907 and filed a homestead claim on 160 acres along Medicine Lake's western shore in 1912. By 1923, he had constructed a small hunting cabin approximately 200 yards from the water's edge. The structure was modest, a single room, hewn timber walls, a stone chimney on the north side. According to county records, the cabin was oriented to face east, away from the lake, with the front door opening toward the rising sun. This orientation was typical for the region. Settlers positioned their doors to catch morning light and avoid the prevailing westerly winds. The Thorvaldsen cabin was unremarkable in its design, its placement, and its purpose. Gunnar Thorvaldsen died in 1931. The land passed to his son Eric, who used the cabin intermittently for hunting trips but never lived there permanently. The property remained in the family for 3 more decades. In 1941, a surveyor named Wallace Bratrud was contracted by Sheridan County to document structures on private land adjacent to the newly expanded wildlife refuge. His photographs, preserved in the county assessor's archives, include a clear image of the Thorvaldsen cabin. The structure faces east. The front door is visible. The stone chimney rises on the left side of the frame, indicating the north wall. The photograph is dated September 14, 1941. 11 years later, in August of 1952, an aerial survey was conducted by the Montana Department of Natural Resources to assess land use patterns in the region. Among the images captured was a photograph of the western shore of Medicine Lake. The Thorvaldsen cabin is visible in the frame, but it is no longer facing east. In the 1952 image, the cabin faces the lake. The orientation has shifted approximately 85 degrees counterclockwise. The front door, previously facing the rising sun, now opens toward the water. The stone chimney, previously on the north wall, now appears on what would be the east wall. The cabin had turned. Eric Thorvaldsen was contacted by a county clerk in 1954 during a routine property reassessment. When asked about modifications to the structure, he expressed confusion. According to a handwritten note in the property file, Thorvaldsen stated that no changes had been made to the cabin since his father built it. He had not visited the property in several years and was unaware of any alteration. A follow-up inspection was scheduled but never conducted. The note in the file offers no explanation for the cancellation. Eric Thorvaldsen's widow, Ingrid, was interviewed in 1989 for a local history project organized by the Sheridan County Historical Society. By then, the cabin had been gone for more than 20 years, but Ingrid remembered the confusion surrounding the photographs. "Eric showed them to me once," she said. "The two pictures, the old one and the new one. He couldn't explain it. He said the cabin was the same. He said nobody had touched it, but the pictures were different." He stopped talking about it after a while. I think it bothered him more than he wanted to admit. When asked if the family had ever considered that the cabin might have been physically moved, Ingrid shook her head. "You can't move a cabin like that, not without tearing it apart. And even if you could, why would anyone do it? There was nothing out there. Nobody cared about that land." A former refuge ranger named Harold Svensson, who worked at Medicine Lake from 1958 to 1974, recalled hearing stories about the Thorvaldsen cabin from older residents. "People said it faced the wrong way," he said in a 2003 interview. "I never understood what that meant until someone showed me the survey photos. I figured it was a mistake, mislabeled pictures, something like that. But the county records were clear, same cabin, different orientation. I drove out there once in 62 or 63 just to look at it. The door was facing the lake, just like in the newer photo. I didn't stay long. The place felt wrong, not haunted, just wrong, like it was waiting for something." The Thorvaldsen cabin burned on the night of March 9, 1967. The fire was reported by a passing motorist at approximately 11:30 p.m. By the time volunteer firefighters arrived from Plentywood, a journey of nearly an hour, the structure was fully engulfed. Nothing remained but the stone chimney and a pile of charred timber. The fire marshal's report, filed 2 weeks later, classified the cause as undetermined. But the report included several observations that were never publicly explained. First, the fire had burned in an unusual pattern. According to the marshal, a man named Clifford Haugen, the flames appeared to have originated simultaneously at multiple points around the structure's perimeter, rather than spreading from a single source. This was inconsistent with accidental causes such as a chimney fire or electrical fault, and the cabin had no electricity. Second, the intensity of the fire was difficult to account for. The cabin had stood empty for years. There were no accelerants stored inside, no fuel sources beyond the timber walls themselves. Yet the temperature of the blaze had been sufficient to ut the stone chimney, which showed evidence of thermal stress that Haugen described as extreme. Third, and most troubling, was the ground beneath the cabin. When investigators examined the site the following morning, They discovered that the soil where the structure had stood was frozen solid. Despite the fire's intensity, despite the fact that March temperatures in northeastern Montana rarely dip below freezing at that time of year, and despite the absence of snow or frost anywhere else on the property. Haugen's report concluded with a single sentence that has puzzled researchers ever since. Thermal behavior inconsistent with known fire dynamics. Recommend no further investigation. The Thorvaldsen family sold the land to the federal government in 1971. It was absorbed into the wildlife refuge. No marker indicates where the cabin once stood. The 1941 and 1952 photographs remain in the county archives. They have been examined by historians, surveyors, and at least one forensic image analyst, who confirmed in a 2011 assessment that both images depict the same structure, that neither has been altered or manipulated, and that the orientation difference is physically evident and unexplained. No record exists of the cabin being moved, no contractor was hired, no equipment was brought to the site. And the Thorvaldsen family, who owned the land for nearly 60 years, maintained until their deaths that the cabin had never been touched. Yet somewhere between 1941 and 1952, it turned to face the lake, and then 15 years later, it burned in a fire that should not have behaved the way it did, leaving behind frozen ground and a stone chimney that still stood when everything else was ash. The chimney was demolished in 1973. The stones were hauled away. The site was seeded with native grass. Today, there is nothing to indicate that anything ever stood on the western shore of Medicine Lake. The land is flat and empty, indistinguishable from the miles of prairie that surround it, but the photographs remain, and the questions they raise have never been answered. Why did the cabin turn? Who or what turned it? And why, in its final moments, did it burn so hot that the stone cracked while the earth beneath it froze? Some mysteries offer clues. This one offers only angles, and the stubborn silence of a building that no longer exists. The ice shows things that have not yet happened, and no one can explain how. Medicine Lake lies in Sheridan County, Montana, approximately 30 miles south of the Canadian border. The lake is shallow, no more than 25 feet at its deepest point, and spreads across more than 8,000 acres of protected wetland within the Medicine Lake National Wildlife Refuge. In summer, it teems with migratory birds. In winter, it becomes something else, a flat white expanse of frozen silence where the wind carves patterns into the snow and the ice groans with sounds that carry for miles. The region has been inhabited for thousands of years. The Assiniboine and Sioux peoples consider these lands sacred, though the specific nature of that sacredness is rarely discussed with outsiders. What is known, what has been passed down through generations, is that Medicine Lake is not an ordinary body of water. The elders call it by a name that translates, roughly, as the water that holds faces. The phrase appears in ethnographic records as early as 1909, when a researcher from the Smithsonian Institution documented oral traditions among the Fort Peck tribes. The researcher noted that the name referred to a belief that the lake's winter ice could preserve images, not of the dead, but of the living. Specifically, images of people who had not yet experienced whatever fate the ice was showing. The researcher dismissed this as metaphor. Others have not been so certain. The earliest written account of the phenomenon comes from a fur trader named Jean-Baptiste Renaud, who spent the winter of 1846 to 1847 at a trading post near the confluence of the Missouri and Yellowstone rivers. In a letter to his brother in Quebec, dated March of 1847, Renaud described a journey to a lake 3 days north, where he observed something that disturbed him deeply. "The natives would not accompany me onto the ice," he wrote. "They said the water remembers what has not yet occurred. I thought this superstition until I saw for myself. Beneath the surface, preserved as though in glass, I observed the visages of men. Not corpses, but faces, clear and distinct, their eyes open. I recognized one. It was Pelletier, who had traveled with me from Fort Union. He was alive and well when I left him that morning. I returned to find him dead of fever before nightfall." Renaud's letter was preserved in a family archive in Montreal and was not published until 1983, when a historian included it in a study of French-Canadian fur trade correspondence. The passage about the ice was noted as curious, but received little scholarly attention. 169 years later, the lake would make another appearance in the historical record, this time captured on video. On January 14, 2016, a drone operator named Derek Nystrom was filming aerial footage of Medicine Lake for Ohlama, personal project documenting Montana's winter landscapes. Nystrom, a 32-year-old videographer from Billings, had no prior knowledge of the lake's reputation or the Renaud letter. He was simply looking for dramatic scenery. What he captured was something else. In a segment of footage lasting approximately 47 seconds, the drone's camera passes over a section of ice near the lake's center. Beneath the frozen surface, clearly visible in the high-definition recording, is what appears to be a human silhouette, dark against the pale ice, lying face up, arms extended. The shape is distinct. The proportions are unmistakably human. Nystrom uploaded the footage to YouTube that evening with the title, "Strange Shape Under Medicine Lake Ice." Within 3 hours, the video had accumulated over 12,000 views. Within 6 hours, it was gone. Nystrom later told a reporter from the Billings Gazette that the video had been removed without warning and his account suspended for community guideline violations. He appealed the decision but received no response. The footage was never restored. A friend of Nystrom's, a software developer named Carolyn Foss, had downloaded a copy of the video before it was removed. She shared it on a private forum dedicated to unexplained phenomena, where it circulated briefly before disappearing from that platform as well. Foss reported that her account was also suspended, though she had not uploaded the video publicly. "I don't know what was in that footage," Foss said in a 2018 interview with an independent researcher, "but someone didn't want people to see it. That's the part that bothers me, not the shape under the ice, the reaction to it." Nystrom himself has been reluctant to discuss the incident in recent years. In his last public statement, given to a podcaster in 2019, he said only, "I saw what I saw, I filmed what I filmed, and then it was like it never happened. Make of that what you will." Local residents of Sheridan County have their own perspectives on the footage and on the lake's reputation. Agnes Bluecoat, an Assiniboine elder who grew up on the Fort Peck Reservation, was interviewed in 2017 for a tribal oral history project. When asked about Medicine Lake, she spoke carefully. "The old people called it the water that holds faces," she said. "Not the faces of the dead, the faces of the living. They said if you looked into the ice at the wrong time, you might see someone you knew, someone who was still alive. And if you saw them there, it meant something was coming for them, something they couldn't avoid. She paused before adding, "My grandmother told me never to walk on that ice. She said some things are not meant to be seen before their time." A retired game warden named Russell Dahl, who patrolled the refuge from 1984 to 2011, offered a more measured assessment. "I've heard the stories," he said. "Everyone around here has. I never saw anything myself. But I'll tell you this. I've been on that ice dozens of times, and it never felt right. The sounds it makes, the way the light hits it, there's something off about that place. I couldn't tell you what. But I stopped going out there alone after my first few years." The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which manages the refuge, has no official comment on the 2016 footage or on the lake's folkloric reputation. A Freedom of Information Act request filed in 2017 seeking any documentation related to the video's removal from YouTube was returned with a standard response indicating that no relevant records existed. The original footage has never resurfaced. Derek Nystrom reportedly retains a copy on an encrypted hard drive, but he has declined all requests to share it. Carolyn Foss's downloaded version was lost when her computer suffered a hard drive failure in 2018, a failure she describes as sudden and total, with no data recoverable. What remains are second-hand descriptions, screenshots of uncertain provenance, and the testimony of those who claim to have seen the video before it vanished, and, of course, the lake itself. Medicine Lake freezes every winter, as it has for thousands of years. The ice forms thick and clear in the coldest months, transparent enough in places to see the dark water beneath. Visitors are permitted on the frozen surface, though few venture far from shore. Those who do sometimes report seeing shapes beneath the ice, shadows that move when they should not, outlines that suggest forms the mind struggles to interpret. Most dismiss these as tricks of light, refractions caused by the layered ice and the low winter sun. But a few do not. In February of 2020, an ice fisherman from Wolf Point named Harold Medina was drilling a hole near the lake's center when he noticed something beneath the surface. He described it later as a face looking up at me. He did not recognize it. He packed up his equipment and left. 3 weeks later, his brother-in-law died in a car accident on Highway 2, east of Culbertson. Medina has not returned to Medicine Lake. When asked if the face he saw resembled his brother-in-law, he declined to answer. "I don't want to think about that," he said. "I don't want to think about what it means if the answer is yes." The ice forms every winter. The lake freezes and thaws, and somewhere beneath its surface, if the stories are to be believed, faces wait to be seen. Faces of people who are still alive. Faces of people who will not be alive for long. The Assiniboine have a saying, "The water remembers what has not yet occurred." Perhaps it is only folklore. Perhaps it is only the way isolated communities make sense of tragedy, finding patterns in randomness, meaning in coincidence. Or perhaps the ice really does remember, and perhaps some memories are better left frozen. "34 people vanished from the official record, and someone decided not to ask why." Medicine Lake Township occupies a remote corner of Sheridan County in northeastern Montana, approximately 30 miles from the Canadian border. The township takes its name from the lake at its center, a shallow, windswept body of water spanning more than 8,000 acres, now protected as the Medicine Lake National Wildlife Refuge. In 1940, the refuge had been established for only 5 years, and the land surrounding it remained sparsely populated by homesteaders, ranchers, and the descendants of Norwegian and German immigrants who had arrived decades earlier seeking cheap land and isolation. They found both in abundance. Sheridan County has never been densely populated. Even today, The entire county contains fewer than 4,000 residents spread across nearly 2,000 square miles. In the 1940s, the population was higher but still thin. Families separated by miles of prairie connected by dirt roads that became impassable in winter and spring. The nearest town of any size was Plentywood, 40 miles to the northeast. Beyond that, there was little but grass, sky, and silence. The people who lived near Medicine Lake were accustomed to hardship. The Great Depression had devastated agricultural communities across the northern plains. Drought, dust storms, and falling crop prices drove thousands from the region in the 1930s. Those who remained were resilient, stubborn, or simply had nowhere else to go. By 1940, the worst seemed to be over. The census that year recorded 31 households within a 5-mile radius of the lake, 118 individuals in total, living in farmhouses and ranch dwellings scattered across the prairie. Their names were recorded, their occupations noted, their ages cataloged. 10 years later, 9 of those households were simply gone. The 1950 census, conducted in April of that year, documented only 22 households in the same geographic area. The missing 9 families represented 34 individuals, men, women, and children, whose names had appeared in the 1940 records but were absent from the 1950 count. This kind of population decline was not unusual for rural Montana in that era. Families left. Farms failed. People moved to cities in search of work. The post-war economy was reshaping American demographics, drawing rural populations toward urban centers. But the 9 families near Medicine Lake left no trace of their departure. A genealogist named Constance Willoughby first identified the discrepancy in 1987 while researching settlement patterns in Sheridan County for a regional history project. She obtained copies of both census records from the National Archives and began cross-referencing the names. The 31 households in 1940 included families with surnames like Fjellstad, Thoresen, Breivik, Krogstad, Haugen, Lindahl, Swanson, Dahl, and Bergstrom, common Norwegian and Scandinavian names reflecting the region's immigration history. 9 of these family names did not appear in the 1950 census. Willoughby checked death records for Sheridan County between 1940 and 1950. None of the 34 individuals were listed. She checked marriage records, looking for women who might have changed their names. Nothing matched. She contacted the Sheridan County Clerk's office in Plentywood, requesting any documentation related to property transfers, relocations, or official notices involving the 9 families. The response she received was unusual. According to Willoughby's account, published in a 1992 article for the Montana Historical Society Quarterly, the clerk's office provided her with copies of the relevant property records, all of which showed the lands in question had been transferred to the federal government between 1941 and 1948 as part of the refuge expansion. But attached to one of the files was a handwritten note on county letterhead, undated and unsigned, containing a single instruction: do not attempt to reconcile. Filed as natural attrition. Willoughby asked the clerk what the note meant. The clerk, a woman named Dorothy Erickson, who had worked in the office since 1963, said she had never seen the note before and had no idea who had written it. Local residents interviewed by Willoughby in the late 1980s offered fragmented and sometimes contradictory accounts of the missing families. Arthur Lund, a retired rancher whose family had lived near Medicine Lake since 1919, remembered several of the names. The Thoresen place was about 3 miles south of us, he said. They had 4 children, I think. The oldest boy was in my class at school. 1 year they were there, the next they weren't. My father said they'd moved to Minnesota. That was that. Nobody asked questions. When Willoughby asked if Lund had ever heard from the Thoresens after they left, he shook his head. People moved on. That's what people did. You didn't write letters. You didn't keep in touch. You just moved on. Edna Stromberg, who was born in 1932 and lived her entire life within 10 miles of the lake, had a different recollection. "There were stories," she said. "My mother wouldn't talk about it directly, but she'd say things sometimes. She said the families by the lake had gone quiet. I didn't know what that meant when I was young. I still don't really. But she never used the word moved. She said gone quiet, like it was something that happened to them, not something they chose." A former county clerk named Gerald Pfeiffer, who held the position from 1951 to 1968, was interviewed by a local journalist in 1994, 2 years before his death. He remembered the property transfers, but claimed the families had been compensated for their land by the federal government. "They were bought out," he said. "That's what the papers showed. Fair market value, signed, and notarized. Where they went after that wasn't our concern." When the journalist asked about the note instructing clerks not to reconcile the census records, Pfeiffer paused for a long moment before responding. "Some things aren't meant to be reconciled," he said. "That's not the same as saying something's wrong. It just means you leave it alone." Attempts to verify the federal compensation claims have been unsuccessful. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which manages the Medicine Lake National Wildlife Refuge, has no records of land purchases from individual families during the 1940s. According to agency documents, the refugees' boundaries were established primarily through transfers of federal land, not private acquisitions. The National Archives contains the original census manuscripts for both 1940 and 1950, confirming the discrepancy Willoughby identified. However, the archives has no supplementary documentation explaining the population loss. No notes, no follow-up surveys, no administrative memos. A Freedom of Information Act request, filed in 2008 by an independent researcher, sought any federal records related to Medicine Lake Township between 1940 and 1950. The response indicated that several potentially relevant files had been transferred to a regional storage facility in Denver in 1962, but that those files were subsequently destroyed in 1978 as part of a routine records purge. The 9 families, the Fjeldstads, the Thoresons, the Breiviks, and 6 others, appear in no records after 1940. They filed no tax returns, they registered no vehicles, they enrolled no children in schools, they cast no votes, they simply ceased to exist as documented Americans. Constance Willoughby continued her research until her death in 2014, but she never identified what happened to the 34 individuals. In her final published article on the subject, written in 2009, she noted that the discrepancy remained one of the most troubling demographic anomalies in Montana's 20th century records. "These were not transients," she wrote. "They were established families with children, livestock, and property. They had roots, and then, within a single decade, they vanished. Not from the land, but from history itself. Someone decided that their disappearance required no explanation. Someone wrote a note instructing future clerks to leave the matter alone, and for 70 years that instruction was followed." The note remains in the Sheridan County Clerk's office, tucked into a file folder labeled Medicine Lake Township, pre-1950. It has never been authenticated. Its author has never been identified. Land where the 9 families once lived is now part of the wildlife refuge, returned to grass and wetland, home to pelicans and geese. No foundations remain, no fence posts, no evidence that anyone ever lived there at all. 34 people were counted in 1940. They were not counted in 1950. And somewhere in a county office in Plentywood, a handwritten note still instructs anyone who notices, do not attempt to reconcile. The instruction has been followed for more than 80 years. Perhaps that, more than anything, is the most disturbing part of the story. Not that 34 people disappeared, but that someone, long ago, decided that their disappearance was not worth questioning, and no one has questioned it since. Something beneath Medicine Lake has been breathing for a very long time, and for 2 years someone was listening. Medicine Lake National Wildlife Refuge occupies 31,000 acres of protected wetland in Sheridan County, Montana, roughly 30 miles from the Canadian border. The refuge was established in 1935 to protect migratory bird populations along the Central Flyway, and today it remains one of the most important nesting sites for American white pelicans in North America. The landscape is flat, treeless, and exposed, a remnant of ancient glacial activity that carved shallow depressions across the northern plains, leaving behind a network of lakes, marshes, and prairie potholes. The lake itself is shallow, rarely exceeding 25 feet in depth. Its bed consists of clay, silt, and organic sediment accumulated over thousands of years. Geologically, the region is considered stable. There are no fault lines, no volcanic activity, no known sources of seismic disturbance within hundreds of miles, which is why what happened in 1979 remains so difficult to explain. The refuge headquarters sits on a low rise overlooking the eastern shore of the lake, a cluster of administrative buildings and maintenance structures that have changed little since the 1960s. In the spring of 1979, a small seismograph station was installed on the property as part of a broader monitoring network coordinated by the United States Geological Survey. The network was designed to detect and catalog seismic activity across the northern Great Plains, a region not known for earthquakes but considered scientifically under-monitored. The station at Medicine Lake was staffed by a single technician, a recent graduate of the Montana College of Mineral Science and Technology named Victor Lindstrom. His job was simple: maintain the equipment, log any seismic events, and transmit data to the regional office in Denver once per week. For the first 3 months, Lindstrom recorded nothing of significance. The seismograph registered the faint background noise common to all such instruments: distant truck traffic, wind vibration, the occasional tremor from mining operations in eastern Montana. The readings were unremarkable. Then, in August of 1979, the pattern changed. On August 14th, the seismograph began detecting a low-frequency vibration originating from beneath the lake bed. The signal was faint but persistent, hovering around 7 Hz, well below the threshold of human hearing. It did not correlate with any known seismic event. It did not match the signature of industrial activity, transportation, or weather phenomena. And it pulsed. Lindstrom noted in his logbook that the signal appeared in irregular intervals, sometimes lasting several minutes, sometimes only seconds. The gaps between pulses ranged from a few minutes to several hours. There was no discernible pattern, no predictable rhythm. And yet, as Lindstrom wrote in an entry dated August 19th, the overall effect is almost respiratory, like something very large, very slow, drawing breath. He reported the anomaly to his supervisor in Denver, a geophysicist named Dr. Eleanor Wentworth. According to correspondence later obtained through archival research, Wentworth instructed Lindstrom to continue monitoring and to compile a detailed record of the signal's characteristics. She noted that low-frequency vibrations could sometimes be produced by underground water movement, gas pockets, or thermal activity, though none of these explanations fit the geological profile of the Medicine Lake region. Lindstrom continued his work. The signal continued its pulsing. A retired Fish and Wildlife Service employee named Marshall Gunderson, who worked at the refuge from 1974 to 1986, remembered Lindstrom and the monitoring station well. He was a quiet kid, Gunderson recalled in a 2011 interview. Kept to himself mostly, spent a lot of time in that little shed with his equipment. I asked him once what he was listening for. He said, "I don't know yet, but something's down there." I figured he meant groundwater or something like that. He didn't elaborate. Gunderson also recalled that Lindstrom's demeanor changed over the course of his assignment. By the end of that first year, he seemed, preoccupied, distracted. He'd stand out by the lake sometimes, just staring at the water. I asked him once if everything was all right. He said, "The signal never stops. Even when the machine doesn't pick it up, I can feel it." I didn't know what to make of that. Another witness, a seasonal maintenance worker named Dale Syverson, recalled a conversation with Lindstrom in the summer of 1980. "He told me the vibrations were getting stronger," Syverson said. "Not louder, stronger. He said it was like the source was rising, getting closer to the surface. I asked him what he thought was causing it. He just shook his head and said, 'Nothing I learned in school prepared me for this.'" Lindstrom's logbooks from the 2-year monitoring period were reportedly submitted to the USGS regional office in Denver when the station was decommissioned in early 1981. According to a 1983 internal memo, later obtained through a Freedom of Information Act request, the logs were received and cataloged, but not prioritized for analysis due to resource constraints. By 1987, the logs could not be located. A researcher named Patricia Hollenbeck attempted to access the Medicine Lake seismic data in 1994 as part of a doctoral thesis on anomalous geophysical phenomena. Her FOIA request was returned with a form letter stating that the records could not be located in current archives and that no backup copies were known to exist. Hollenbeck contacted Dr. Eleanor Wentworth, who had retired from the USGS in 1989. Wentworth confirmed that she had received Lindstrom's reports and that the signal he documented was genuinely unusual, but she claimed to have no copies of the data and could not explain why the official records had disappeared. "These things happen," Wentworth said in a 1995 interview. "Files get lost. Budgets get cut. Priorities shift. It doesn't mean there's a conspiracy. It just means nobody cared enough to preserve the data." But Hollenbeck's research uncovered another detail that complicated this explanation. According to budget documents from the USGS regional office, funding for the Medicine Lake monitoring station was not cut due to routine fiscal constraints. It was specifically terminated in February of 1981, 3 months ahead of schedule, with the notation, "Program objectives achieved. No further monitoring required." What those objectives were, and how they could have been achieved when the signal source was never identified, remains unclear. Victor Lindstrom left the USGS in 1982. He did not pursue a career in geophysics. According to public records, he moved to Oregon, where he worked as a carpenter until his death in 2008. In the years before his death, Lindstrom reportedly told family members that his time at Medicine Lake had been the most important and the most disturbing of his professional life. His niece, Sandra Lindstrom Reyes, shared one detail in a 2015 podcast interview. "He told me once that the vibrations weren't random," she said. "He said they had structure, not a pattern he could decode, but structure, like language. He said it felt like something was trying to communicate, but not with us, with something else, something deeper." She paused before adding, "He never explained what he meant by that, and I never asked." The monitoring station at Medicine Lake was dismantled in the spring of 1981. The equipment was removed. The shed was repurposed for storage. No seismograph has been installed at the refuge since. The lake remains, the refuge remains, and somewhere beneath the clay and silt of the lake bed, 7 hertz below the threshold of human hearing, something may still be pulsing. There is no way to know. No one is listening anymore. But Victor Lindstrom listened for 2 years. He filled logbooks with data that no longer exists, documenting a signal that no one has been able to explain. And in the end, he walked away from science entirely, content to spend his remaining decades building houses and not thinking about what he had heard beneath the water. Or perhaps not content. perhaps simply unable to think about anything else. The frequency was never identified, the source was never located, and the data, all of it, has vanished. What remains is silence. And beneath the silence, if you believe the records that no longer exist, something that breathes. She photographed something at Medicine Lake, and whatever it was, she never wanted anyone else to see it. Medicine Lake National Wildlife Refuge lies in the northeastern corner of Montana, approximately 30 miles from the Canadian border. The refuge encompasses 31,000 acres of protected wetland, a vast flat expanse of marsh, prairie, and shallow water that serves as one of the most important migratory bird habitats in North America. Each autumn, hundreds of thousands of waterfowl pass through on their journey south along the Central Flyway. Snow geese, Canada geese, tundra swans, and dozens of species of ducks. The sky fills with birds, the air fills with their calls. And then, as winter approaches, they leave, and the land returns to silence. The refuge was established in 1935, carved from homestead land that had proven too harsh for agriculture. The soil was marginal, the winters were brutal, the isolation was absolute. By the time federal protection arrived, most of the families who had tried to make a life near the lake had already given up and moved on. What remains is wilderness, or something close to it. The nearest town of any size is Plentywood, 40 miles northeast. The refuge headquarters consists of a few administrative buildings on the lake's eastern shore, staffed by a handful of employees who manage the land and monitor the bird populations. Visitors are welcome during designated seasons, but few come. The roads are unpaved, the facilities are minimal, and the landscape, while beautiful in its austerity, offers little to attract casual tourists. It was this isolation that drew Margaret Lindahl to Medicine Lake in September of 1996. Lindahl was 47 years old, a professional nature photographer based in Great Falls. She had built a modest reputation over 2 decades of work, publishing images in regional magazines, contributing to wildlife calendars, and occasionally exhibiting at galleries in Montana and Wyoming. Her specialty was bird photography, patient, technically precise work that required long hours in remote locations, waiting for the right light and the right moment. She arrived at Medicine Lake on September 8, 1996, according to refuge visitor logs. She was alone. She told the ranger on duty, a man named Dennis Kowalczyk, that she planned to spend approximately 3 weeks photographing the autumn migration. She had done similar projects at other refuges in the past. There was nothing unusual about her request. Kowalczyk remembered her as quiet and professional. He assigned her a campsite near the western shore and provided her with maps of the refuge's public access areas. She thanked him and drove off toward the lake. Over the following 3 weeks, Lindahl was seen occasionally by refuge staff and other visitors. She was always alone, always carrying her camera equipment, always focused on her work. A maintenance worker named Ronald Backen recalled passing her on a trail near Homestead Bay. She was standing very still, looking out at the water, he said. I said hello. She didn't respond. I figured she was concentrating on something, waiting for a shot. Photographers are like that sometimes. Lindahl departed the refuge on September 29th. She had exposed over 200 frames of medium-format film during her stay. According to her personal records, recovered after her death, she titled the series, What Waits Beneath the Flyway. She never showed the photographs to anyone. Margaret Lindahl returned to Great Falls in early October and resumed her normal routine. She met with clients. She processed the film from her Medicine Lake trip at her usual lab. She had the negatives sleeved and cataloged. And then, according to bank records, she rented a safe deposit box at First Security Bank on October 14th and placed the entire collection, all 200 negatives, inside. The box was opened only once more during her lifetime. On January 6, 1997, when Lindahl visited the bank and spent approximately 45 minutes alone in the viewing room with the negatives. A bank employee who assisted her that day, a woman named Judith Holloway, later recalled that Lindahl appeared pale and distracted when she emerged. "I asked if everything was all right," Holloway said in a 2003 interview. "She looked at me like she didn't understand the question. Then she said, 'Some things shouldn't be kept.' I thought she meant the photographs weren't good enough, that she was disappointed with them, but she didn't throw them away. She put them back in the box and left." Margaret Lindahl was found dead in her Great Falls apartment on February 11, 1997. The cause of death was ruled suicide. She left no note. Her estate, managed by a younger sister named Carolyn Lindahl Reeves, discovered the safe deposit box during the probate process. The negatives were removed and, per instructions in Margaret's will, donated to the Montana Historical Society for preservation and scholarly access. The Historical Society accepted the donation. They cataloged the collection under the title Margaret had given it, "What Waits Beneath the Flyway." And then, according to institutional records, they placed the negatives in archival storage and classified them as restricted, not available for public viewing. No explanation was provided. No exhibition was ever planned. And for nearly 3 decades, every request to view the collection has been denied. A journalist named Franklin Ostrowski attempted to access the photographs in 2004 while researching a story on Montana nature photographers. His request was rejected with a form letter stating that the collection was under review for conservation concerns and would not be available for the foreseeable future. Ostrowski followed up with the Historical Society's Director of Collections, a woman named Dr. Helen Magnuson. According to Ostrowski's notes, Magnuson was initially evasive, citing standard preservation protocols. When pressed, she acknowledged that the negatives were in good condition and did not require special conservation treatment. When asked why, then, they remained restricted, Magnuson paused for a long moment before responding. "Some collections are complicated," she said. "The donor's wishes, the circumstances of acquisition, the content itself, these things factor into our decisions. I'm not at liberty to discuss specifics, but I can tell you that the decision to restrict access was made at the institutional level, and it stands." Ostrowski asked if she had personally viewed the photographs. Magnuson did not answer. Carolyn Lindahl Reeves, Margaret's sister, has spoken publicly about the collection only once, in a 2011 interview with a podcast focused on unsolved mysteries. She described her sister as a deeply private person who had become increasingly withdrawn in the months before her death. "She wouldn't talk about the Medicine Lake trip," Carolyn said. "I asked her about it once, maybe a week after she got back. She just shook her head and changed the subject. I asked if the photographs had turned out well. She said they turned out exactly as they should have. I didn't know what that meant. I still don't." When asked if she had ever seen the photographs herself, Carolyn hesitated. "The Historical Society contacted me a few years after Margaret died," she said. "They asked if I wanted to view the collection before it was permanently restricted. I thought about it. I thought about it for a long time, and then I decided I didn't want to know. Whatever Margaret saw at that lake, whatever she captured on film, she didn't want to share it. She made that clear. I have to respect that, even if I don't understand it. The negatives remain in storage. The restriction remains in place. And the 200 images that Margaret Lindahl considered important enough to preserve, but too disturbing to share, have never been seen by anyone outside the Historical Society's staff, if they have been seen at all. A former archivist who worked at the Montana Historical Society from 2001 to 2009, speaking on condition of anonymity, offered one final detail. "I was there when they first processed the Lindahl donation," the archivist said. "The head of collections at the time, not Magnuson, her predecessor, he looked at the negatives, just a few of them held up to the light. He put them back in the box almost immediately. He didn't say anything, but his hands were shaking. I asked him later what he'd seen. He told me, 'Nothing that should exist.' That's all he would say." Margaret Lindahl spent 3 weeks at Medicine Lake in the autumn of 1996. She pointed her camera at the water, the birds, the sky. She captured 200 images of whatever she found there, and then she locked them away, told no one what they contained, and chose to leave this world without explanation. The flyway still passes over Medicine Lake every autumn. The birds still come and go in their hundreds of thousands. And somewhere in a climate-controlled vault in Helena, 200 negatives wait in darkness. Images of something a woman saw nearly 30 years ago, something she titled, something she preserved, something she refused to share. What waits beneath the flyway? Margaret Lindahl knew, and she took the answer with her. The motor was still running when they found the boat, as if someone had simply stepped away and never come back. Medicine Lake lies in Sheridan County, Montana, approximately 30 miles south of the Canadian border. The lake is shallow, officially no deeper than 25 feet, and spreads across more than 8,000 acres of protected wetland within the Medicine Lake National Wildlife Refuge. The water is murky with sediment, visibility rarely exceeding a few feet even in optimal conditions. The bottom is soft clay and organic silt, accumulated over millennia of seasonal flooding and drought. The refuge was established in 1935 primarily to protect migratory bird populations along the Central Flyway. Today, it remains one of the most important nesting sites for American white pelicans in North America. Visitors come for bird watching, photography, and, during designated seasons, fishing. The lake supports populations of northern pike, yellow perch, and walleye, drawing anglers from across the region despite the remote location and limited facilities. The eastern shore is particularly isolated. A single boat launch provides access, a concrete ramp that descends into the shallows near a small parking area. Beyond that, there is nothing but marsh grass, mudflat, and the endless Montana sky. Cell phone coverage is unreliable. The nearest town is Medicine Lake, population approximately 250, 3 miles to the north. Emergency services must be summoned from Plentywood, 40 miles away. It is not a place where people expect anything to happen. And for decades, nothing did. On the morning of August 14, 2001, a man named Gerald Kowalski and his 14-year-old son, Matthew, drove from their home in Sidney, Montana, approximately 60 miles southeast, to spend the day fishing at Medicine Lake. Gerald was 43, a machinist at a manufacturing plant. Matthew had just completed 8th grade. By all accounts, they were experienced outdoorsmen who had fished together for years. They stopped at the refuge headquarters around 7:30 in the morning and rented a 14-foot aluminum boat with a small outboard motor. The rental was processed by a seasonal employee named Kendra Bergstrom, who noted that Gerald paid in cash and signed the standard liability waiver. He mentioned they planned to fish near the center of the lake, where the pike were reportedly active. Bergstrom gave them a map of the refuge and reminded them to return the boat by 5 o'clock. That was the last confirmed sighting of Gerald and Matthew Kowalski. At approximately 2:15 that afternoon, a birdwatcher named Howard Gunderson was photographing pelicans near the eastern shore when he noticed a boat drifting toward the mudflat. The motor was running at low throttle, pushing the vessel in slow, irregular circles. There was no one aboard. Gunderson waded out and grabbed the bow, pulling the boat to shore. Inside he found 2 tackle boxes, both closed, a red cooler containing sandwiches still wrapped in plastic, 2 fishing rods, one with its line still in the water. 2 life jackets neatly stowed beneath the seats, and a single shoe, a man's brown leather work boot, right foot, size 11, lying on the floor of the boat near the stern. Nothing else. No signs of struggle, no blood, no indication of what had happened or where the occupants had gone. The Sheridan County Sheriff's Office received the call at 2:47. Deputies arrived within the hour. A search began immediately. Howard Gunderson, the birdwatcher who discovered the boat, was among the first witnesses interviewed. He described the scene with careful precision. "The motor was still running when I got to it," he said, "just idling along. The boat was moving in circles like nobody was steering. I thought maybe someone had fallen overboard, had an accident or something, but the water there is only 3 or 4 feet deep. If someone had fallen in, they would have just stood up." He paused before adding, "The shoe bothered me, just one shoe, like it had been left behind on purpose. But why would someone take off one shoe?" A refuge ranger named Curtis Halverson assisted with the initial search. He recalled the condition of the boat in a 2004 interview. "Everything was in order," he said. "The tackle boxes were organized. The cooler was full. They hadn't even eaten lunch yet. The fishing rods were set up and ready to use. It was like they'd been in the middle of a normal day, and then they just stopped. Like someone hit pause and they disappeared." Halverson also noted something unusual about the boat's fuel consumption. The tank was almost full. They'd only been out for maybe 6 hours, but they hadn't used more than a gallon or 2. That motor should have burned through more fuel than that, especially running since whenever they went missing. It didn't add up. The mother of Matthew Kowalski, a woman named Deborah, was contacted that evening. In a rare public statement given 3 years later, she described her last conversation with her son. "He called me from the car that morning on the drive up," she said. "He was excited. He said he had a feeling they were going to catch something big. Those were his exact words. 'I have a feeling, Mom.' I told him to be careful. He said, 'It's just a lake, Mom. What's going to happen?'" The search for Gerald and Matthew Kowalski lasted 9 days and involved more than 70 personnel from multiple agencies. Divers were brought in from Billings. Sonar equipment was deployed. Helicopters surveyed the lake and surrounding prairie. On the 3rd day of the search, a decision was made to lower the water level. The lake's outlet structure was opened, and over the following week, the water dropped by approximately 18 inches, exposing hundreds of acres of mudflat and shallows that had been submerged. Nothing was found, no bodies, no clothing, no equipment, no trace of either man. The sheriff's report, obtained through a public records request, contains a summary of the physical evidence collected from the boat. The inventory includes 2 tackle boxes containing standard fishing equipment, 1 red cooler containing 6 sandwiches, 3 bottles of water, and a bag of potato chips, 2 fishing rods with attached reels, 2 life jackets, 1 pair of polarized sunglasses, 1 brown leather work boot, size 11, right foot, identified as belonging to Gerald Kowalski by his wife. The report also contains a single sentence that has been the subject of considerable speculation in the years since. Search of lakebed and shoreline produced no biological material consistent with human remains. This phrasing is unusual. Standard missing persons reports typically note the absence of evidence. The specific reference to biological material suggests that investigators were looking for something specific and did not find it. A forensic consultant named Dr. Patricia Swenson, who reviewed the case file in 2012 at the request of a documentary producer, noted the anomaly. "In a drowning case, you would expect to find something," she said. "Hair, tissue, clothing fibers, bodies leave traces, especially in shallow water with a soft sediment bottom. The fact that an extensive search, including partial drainage of the lake, produced no biological evidence at all is highly unusual. It suggests either that the victims were not in the lake or that something removed all traces of their presence." When asked what could account for such removal, Swenson declined to speculate. The Kowalski case was officially classified as a presumed drowning in 2003, despite the absence of evidence supporting that conclusion. The boat was returned to the rental company. The personal effects were given to the family. The file was closed. Gerald Kowalski's brother, a man named Thomas, has never accepted the official explanation. In a 2015 interview, he expressed his frustration. "They drained the lake," he said. "They had divers, sonar, helicopters. They found nothing, not a scrap of clothing, not a bone. My brother and my nephew didn't just vanish into thin air. Something happened to them, and nobody can tell me what." Deborah Kowalski remarried in 2008 and moved to Colorado. She has not spoken publicly about her son's disappearance in over a decade. Medicine Lake continues to operate as a wildlife refuge. The boat launch, where Gerald and Matthew Kowalski began their final fishing trip, remains in use. The water has returned to its normal level. The pike still swim in the murky shallows. And somewhere in the lake, beneath the lake, or somewhere else entirely, two people who set out on an ordinary August morning have never been found. The boat arrived empty. The motor was still running. The sandwiches were never eaten, and a single shoe sits in an evidence locker in Plentywood, waiting for an explanation that has never come. 23 years later, the case remains open. The questions remain unanswered, and the lake keeps its secrets, as it always has, beneath water too murky to see through, and above a bottom too soft to hold anything for long. Or so the official reports would have us believe. Seven strangers dreamed the same place, and when someone finally went there, the place was already counting them. Medicine Lake occupies a shallow basin in Sheridan County, Montana, roughly 30 miles from the Canadian border. The refuge surrounding it, 31,000 acres of protected wetland, was established in 1935 to safeguard migratory bird populations along the Central Flyway. The landscape is flat, treeless, and exposed, shaped by glacial forces that retreated 12,000 years ago, leaving behind a network of prairie potholes and seasonal lakes that dot the northern plains like scattered mirrors. The lake itself rarely exceeds 25 feet in depth. Its shoreline is irregular, fringed with cattails and marsh grass that shift with the water level. The northwestern shore is particularly remote, accessible only by a rough service road that floods in spring and becomes impassable in winter. There are no trails there, no facilities, no reason for visitors to venture into that section of the refuge. The Assiniboine and Sioux peoples, whose ancestral lands include this region, have long regarded certain areas around the lake as significant, though the specific nature of that significance is rarely discussed with outsiders. Elders speak of places where the land pays attention, locations that seem to draw things toward them, or to reach outward in ways that cannot be easily explained. The northwestern shore is one such place. It has no official name. It appears on no visitor maps. And until 2019, almost no one outside the immediate region knew it existed. The first report came in 2004 from a woman named Ingrid Brynildsen, a 42-year-old accountant living in suburban Minneapolis. She had never visited Montana. She had no connection to the northern plains. And yet, beginning in March of that year, she began experiencing recurring dreams about a lake she could not identify. In the dreams, she stood on a muddy shore facing dark water. The sky was overcast. There were no birds, no sounds, no movement, just stillness. And in the distance, partially submerged in the shallows, she could see something, a shape, a marker, something that drew her attention, even though she could never quite make out what it was. She would wake with a specific set of numbers in her mind. Coordinates, latitude and longitude, precise to the fourth decimal place. She had no training in navigation. She did not know how to interpret geographic coordinates, but the numbers stayed with her. clear and persistent, long after the other details of the dream had faded. She wrote them down: 48.4936 degrees north, 104.5122 degrees west. Brynildson did not pursue the matter. She assumed the dreams were meaningless, stress perhaps, or some fragment of a documentary she had half-watched and forgotten. The dreams continued intermittently for several months, then stopped. She mentioned them to no one until 2017, when she encountered a forum post from a man in Ohio describing an identical experience. His name was Douglas Wentworth. He was 51, a retired postal worker from Columbus. He had never been to Montana. He had no interest in bird watching or wilderness areas, but in 2009, he began dreaming about a lake, a flat, gray expanse of water under a colorless sky. He dreamed of standing on a shore that felt familiar even though he knew he had never been there, and he woke each time with coordinates burned into his memory. The same coordinates. Exactly. Over the following 2 years, 5 more individuals came forward after discovering Wentworth's post. They lived in different states: Oregon, Texas, Pennsylvania, Florida, and Arizona. They ranged in age from 26 to 63. None of them had any apparent connection to Montana or to each other. All of them reported the same dream. All of them recalled the same coordinates. A podcast producer named Samantha Okonkwo began investigating the phenomenon in 2018 after being contacted by several of the dreamers. She verified their accounts independently, confirming that they had documented their experiences in journals, emails, or social media posts before learning of the others. The consistency was striking. Okonkwo said in a 2020 interview, "These weren't vague impressions. These were specific numbers, 7 digits of latitude, 7 of longitude, and every single person had the same ones. The statistical probability of that happening by chance is essentially 0. Brynildson, the first dreamer, described the psychological weight of the experience. "I spent years thinking I was imagining things," she said. "Then I found out other people were seeing the same place. That made it worse somehow. It meant the dreams weren't just in my head. They were pointing at something real." Douglas Wentworth expressed similar unease. "I looked up the coordinates on Google Earth after I saw the forum post," he said. "It's just empty land. Marsh, prairie, nothing remarkable. But when I saw it on the screen, I felt, I don't know how to describe it, recognized, like the place knew I was looking at it." In August of 2019, a researcher affiliated with the phenomenon, a geographer named Dr. Emil Rasmussen from the University of North Dakota, traveled to Medicine Lake to investigate the site. He located the coordinates on the northwestern shore, approximately 1.3 miles from the nearest service road. The terrain matched the descriptions provided by the dreamers: flat, muddy, unremarkable. There was no visible feature to distinguish the location from any other point along the shore, except for the stone. Rasmussen found it partially buried in the mud, approximately 30 yards from the waterline. It was roughly rectangular, about 18 inches tall and 8 inches wide, made of granite or a similar material. It bore no inscription, no carving, no symbol, only notches, 7 of them cut into the upper edge of the stone in a neat row. Rasmussen photographed the marker and attempted to determine its age and origin. The stone showed significant weathering, suggesting it had been in place for decades, possibly longer. There was no record of any monument, survey marker, or memorial at that location. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which manages the refuge, had no documentation of the stone's existence. When Rasmussen shared his findings with the dreamers, several of them noted the correspondence immediately. 7 notches, 7 dreamers. That's when it stopped feeling like a mystery and started feeling like something else, Brynildson said. Like we weren't discovering something, like we were being counted. Dr. Rasmussen submitted a report on his findings to an academic journal specializing in anomalous phenomena. The paper was rejected without peer review. He attempted to publish a revised version in 2021. That submission was also rejected, with the editorial board citing insufficient empirical foundation. His photographs of the stone remain in his personal archive. He has not returned to the site. The 7 dreamers have stayed in intermittent contact through a private online group. As of 2023, none of them has reported new dreams. None of them has visited Medicine Lake. And as far as anyone knows, no 8th dreamer has emerged. The stone, presumably, remains on the northwestern shore, half buried in mud, unmarked on any map, bearing its 7 notches in silent testimony to something no one can explain. 7 people, scattered across a continent, dreamed the same coordinates. They saw the same water, felt the same pull, woke with the same numbers etched into their minds. And when someone finally went to the place they had all been dreaming about, they found a marker that seemed to have been waiting for them. Counting them, perhaps there is a rational explanation. Perhaps the dreams are coincidence, the coordinates a fluke, the notches the work of some long-forgotten surveyor with no connection to the dreamers at all. Or perhaps the land does pay attention, as the elders say. Perhaps some places reach out across distance and time, selecting witnesses for reasons that cannot be understood. The coordinates remain 48.4936 degrees north, 104.5122 degrees west. The stone remains with its 7 notches. And somewhere, perhaps, an 8th person's beginning to dream of a lake they have never seen, waking each morning with numbers they cannot explain, feeling a pull toward a place that already knows their name. The counting, it seems, may not be finished. The lake smelled wrong that summer, and no one has ever been able to say why. Medicine Lake sits in the far northeastern corner of Montana, a shallow body of water spanning more than 8,000 acres within the boundaries of the Medicine Lake National Wildlife Refuge. The refuge was established in 1935 to protect migratory bird populations along the Central Flyway, and the lake itself serves as one of the most important nesting sites for American white pelicans in North America. The surrounding terrain is flat prairie, treeless and windswept, with the Canadian border lying roughly 30 miles to the north. The region has never been densely populated. Sheridan County, where the lake is located, contains fewer than 4,000 residents today, spread across nearly 2,000 square miles. In the early 1970s, the population was slightly higher, but still sparse. Farmers, ranchers, and the descendants of Scandinavian and German immigrants who had arrived decades earlier seeking land and opportunity. The nearest town is Medicine Lake, population approximately 250, 3 miles north of the refuge. Beyond that, Plentywood lies 40 miles to the northeast. The people who live here are accustomed to the rhythms of the land. They know the smell of rain coming across the prairie, the scent of alkali flats baking in summer heat, the sharp mineral tang of well water drawn from deep aquifers. They know what the lake should smell like. In the summer of 1973, the lake smelled like something else entirely. The first reports came in early July. Fishermen arriving at dawn noticed an unusual odor rising from the water, metallic, sharp, reminiscent of copper pennies, or, as several witnesses later described it, old blood. The smell was strongest near the center of the lake, but detectable from the shore, particularly on calm days when the wind did not disperse it. A local farmer named Arvid Gustafsson, who had fished Medicine Lake since childhood, was among the first to report the anomaly. On July 6th, he drove to the Sheridan County Courthouse in Plentywood and spoke with a health department official named Dorothy Reinhardt. According to records later obtained from county archives, Gustafsson described the odor as unlike anything I've smelled in 50 years on this lake, and expressed concern that something had contaminated the water. Reinhardt filed a report and contacted the Montana Department of Health and Environmental Sciences in Helena. A water quality specialist named Dr. Bernard Lockwood was assigned to investigate. Lockwood arrived at Medicine Lake on July 14th. He collected samples from multiple locations, near the shore, at the center of the lake, and from the outflow channel that drains toward the east. He also interviewed several residents who had noticed the odor. According to his preliminary field notes, preserved in the Montana State Archives, the smell was distinctly metallic with ferrous or cupric characteristics. He noted that the water appeared visually normal. No unusual coloration, no algae blooms, no surface films. The odor seemed to have no visible source. Lockwood returned to Helena with his samples on July 17th. His preliminary findings were never released. The smell persisted through the rest of July and into August. Residents who had grown up around the lake began to avoid it. Fishing dropped off dramatically. Children were kept away from the shore. The annual summer picnic organized by the Medicine Lake Community Club was relocated to a park in Plentywood. Arvid Gustafson continued to monitor the situation, keeping a handwritten log of his observations. His entries, later shared with a local historian, described the smell as constant but variable. Stronger on some days, weaker on others, but never entirely absent. July 23rd, one entry reads, "Wind from the west. Smell very strong today, like putting your face over a bucket of pennies. Mildred won't let me bring fish home anymore. Says she can't stand the thought of eating something from that water." His wife, Mildred Gustafson, was interviewed in 1998 for a regional oral history project. She remembered the summer vividly. "It wasn't just the smell," she said. "It was how it made you feel. Standing near the water, breathing that air, it gave me headaches. Not bad ones, but persistent, like a pressure behind my eyes. Arvid felt it too, though he wouldn't admit it. We'd lived near that lake our whole lives. We knew something was wrong." A refuge ranger named Wallace Lindquist, who worked at Medicine Lake from 1971 to 1984, offered a more measured assessment. "There was definitely an odor that summer," he said in a 2002 interview. "Metallic, like everyone described. I reported it to my supervisors. They said the state was handling it. That was the last I heard." An Assiniboine elder named Franklin Whitehorse, interviewed in 1989 for a tribal history project, provided a different perspective. "The old people called that smell the lake bleeding," he said. "They said it happened before, a long time ago, before the white settlers came. They said it meant the water was remembering something, or maybe forgetting something. I don't know which is worse." Dr. Bernard Lockwood's water samples were processed at the Montana Department of Health Laboratory in Helena during the last week of July 1973. According to internal correspondence obtained through a Freedom of Information Act request filed in 2008, the initial analysis detected elevated levels of metallic compounds inconsistent with baseline readings for the Medicine Lake watershed. The specific compounds were not identified in the correspondence. A follow-up memo, dated August 3rd, indicated that the samples had been forwarded to federal authorities for additional analysis at the request of an unnamed agency. The samples never returned. The 2008 FOIA request, filed by an independent researcher named Patricia Okonkwo, sought all documentation related to the 1973 water quality investigation at Medicine Lake. The response, received 14 months later, stated that the original samples had been transferred to federal custody pursuant to interagency protocol, and that no records of subsequent analysis are maintained by the state of Montana. When Okonkwo filed a follow-up request with the Environmental Protection Agency, the National Institutes of Health, and the Centers for Disease Control, all three agencies responded that they had no records pertaining to Medicine Lake water samples from 1973. The samples, in effect, had vanished. Dr. Lockwood retired from the Montana Department of Health in 1986. He died in 1994 without ever publishing his findings from the Medicine Lake investigation. His personal papers, donated to the Montana Historical Society, contain no reference to the case. Dorothy Reinhardt, the county health official who first received Arvid Gustafson's complaint, was contacted by a journalist in 2001. She confirmed that she had filed a report in July 1973, but claimed to have no memory of the outcome. "These things happened all the time," she said. "People complained about smells, about water quality, about all sorts of things. Most of it turned out to be nothing. I assume this was the same." The smell dissipated in late August of 1973, approximately 6 weeks after it first appeared. By September, residents reported that the lake had returned to normal. Fishing resumed. The annual picnic returned to its usual location the following year. But the older generation never forgot. Arvid Gustafson died in 2003 at the age of 89. According to his daughter, Karen Gustafson Holte, he never ate fish from Medicine Lake again after the summer of 1973. "He said the smell got into his head," she recalled. "He couldn't shake it. Every time he looked at a fish from that lake, he smelled copper. He said it was like the lake had marked him somehow. I always thought he was being dramatic, but now, all these years later, I'm not so sure." Mildred Gustafson outlived her husband by 7 years. In her final interview, conducted in 2009, she was asked if she had any theory about what had caused the smell. She thought for a long moment before answering. "The lake was trying to tell us something," she said. "I don't know what. Maybe it was sick. Maybe something was happening underneath that we couldn't see. All I know is water doesn't smell like blood for no reason, and the fact that nobody ever explained it, that bothers me more than the smell itself." She paused, then added, "Some things are better left alone. But that doesn't mean they go away. It just means nobody's looking. Medicine Lake remains. The birds return each spring. The water looks the same as it always has, flat, gray-brown, unremarkable. But somewhere in a federal archive, or perhaps in no archive at all, samples of that water may still exist. Samples that were taken, analyzed, and then quietly disappeared from every official record. Samples of water that smelled like copper, or old blood, or something else that no one has ever been able to name. The summer of 1973 ended more than 50 years ago. The people who remember it are mostly gone. And the lake keeps its secrets, as it always has, beneath a surface that reflects nothing but sky. He counted birds for 18 years, and then one day he stopped, leaving behind a warning no one has ever been able to explain. Medicine Lake National Wildlife Refuge occupies 31,000 acres of protected wetland in Sheridan County, Montana, approximately 30 miles from the Canadian border. The refuge was established in 1935 to protect migratory bird populations along the Central Flyway, and today it remains one of the most important nesting sites for American white pelicans in North America. Each autumn, hundreds of thousands of waterfowl pass through: snow geese, Canada geese, tundra swans, and dozens of species of ducks, transforming the flat prairie landscape into a temporary metropolis of wings and calls. Counting those birds has always been essential to the refuge's mission. Population surveys, conducted annually during peak migration, provide data that shapes conservation policy at the state and federal level. The work is tedious but critical. Observers stationed at designated points around the lake, tallying species and numbers from dawn until dusk, recording fluctuations that reveal the health of ecosystems stretching from the Arctic to the Gulf of Mexico. The refuge headquarters sits on a low rise overlooking the eastern shore, a cluster of administrative buildings and maintenance structures that have changed little since the 1960s. The staff has always been small, rarely more than a dozen employees, most of them seasonal. The isolation is profound. The nearest town Medicine Lake has a population of approximately 250. The nearest city of any size, Williston, North Dakota, lies nearly 90 miles to the east. It is not a place that attracts attention. It is not a place where unusual things are expected to happen. Harold Voss arrived at Medicine Lake in 1964, a 26-year-old wildlife biologist fresh from a master's program at Montana State University. He was hired as an assistant refuge manager, a position that encompassed everything from habitat maintenance to visitor education. But his primary responsibility, and the work for which he would become known within the Fish and Wildlife Service, was the annual bird census. Voss was meticulous. His surveys, conducted each October from 1965 onward, were considered models of precision. He developed standardized protocols that were later adopted by other refugees in the region. His reports, submitted annually to the regional office in Denver, were comprehensive, detailed, and consistent. For 18 years, Harold Voss counted the birds of Medicine Lake. His numbers tracked population trends, documented species distributions, and contributed to scientific understanding of migratory patterns across the northern plains. Then came 1983. Voss submitted his survey report on October 28th of that year, 2 weeks after completing his fieldwork. The document arrived at the Denver Regional Office in a standard manila envelope, typewritten on refuge letterhead. The first 12 pages were normal: species lists, population estimates, habitat observations, weather conditions. The format matched his previous 18 reports exactly, but the final 3 pages were blank, except for a single sentence, handwritten in black ink at the top of page 13. The numbers are not what they appear to be. No explanation followed, no additional data, no clarification of what Voss meant or why he had abandoned his report mid-completion. A regional supervisor named Dr. Eleanor Pfeiffer contacted the refugee by telephone on November 2nd. According to internal correspondence later obtained through archival research, she spoke with Voss directly and asked him to explain the incomplete submission. His response, as recorded in Pfeiffer's notes, was brief. "I've told you what I can. The rest isn't something I'm able to put into words." When Pfeiffer pressed for clarification, Voss reportedly said, "I've been counting birds at that lake for 18 years. I know what the numbers should be, and I'm telling you, what I counted this year isn't what's actually there. I can't explain it better than that." He submitted his resignation 3 days later. He was 45 years old. Colleagues who worked with Voss during his final years at the refuge offered conflicting accounts of his state of mind. A maintenance supervisor named Warren Lindqvist recalled Voss as steady, professional, the same as he'd always been during the 1983 survey period. He went out every morning, came back every evening, filled his notebooks with numbers. I didn't notice anything unusual until after he turned in his report. But a seasonal biologist named Karen Skovgaard, who assisted with the October census that year, remembered something different. Harold was, I don't know, distracted, she said in a 2005 interview. He'd stop in the middle of counting and just stare at the water. I asked him once if everything was okay. He said, "I keep losing track." I thought he meant his count. Now I'm not so sure. Skovgaard also recalled a conversation on the final day of the survey. He told me he'd noticed something wrong with the numbers. I asked what he meant. He said they don't add up, not the way they should. I figured he'd found an error in his calculations, but the way he said it, there was something in his voice. Not confusion, fear. A longtime resident of Medicine Lake Township, a rancher named Edwin Haugen, had known Voss socially for years. He saw him at a diner in Plentywood a few days after the resignation. Harold looked older, Haugen said, like he hadn't slept. I asked him what happened, why he was leaving. He just shook his head. He said, "Some things don't want to be counted, Ed, and some things count back." I didn't know what to make of that. I still don't. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service conducted a brief internal review of Voss's incomplete report in November 1983. The review, summarized in a memo obtained through a Freedom of Information Act request, concluded that no evidence of professional misconduct or data falsification was identified, and that the incomplete submission appeared to result from personal factors unrelated to refuge operations. A replacement survey was conducted in late November by a team from the regional office. Their findings showed population numbers consistent with historical trends, with no anomalies or unexplained variations. The 1983 data gap was filled. The matter was considered closed, but questions remained. Voss's personal field notebooks from the 1983 survey were never recovered. According to refuge records, he took them with him when he resigned. They were not among his possessions when his estate was settled after his death in 2004. His colleagues attempted to reconstruct his methodology in subsequent years. The standardized protocols he had developed continued to guide refuge surveys for another 2 decades. But several biologists who followed him noted occasional irregularities that defied easy explanation. A survey coordinator named Thomas Bjornstad, who worked at Medicine Lake from 1990 to 2002, described the challenges in a 2008 interview. The counts would sometimes fluctuate in ways that didn't make sense, he said. You'd get a number one day, go back to the same location the next morning, and the population would be completely different. Not by a little, by thousands. We attributed it to bird movement, weather patterns, observer error, but it happened more often at Medicine Lake than anywhere else I've worked. When asked if he had any theory about Voss's final report, Bjornstad hesitated. Harold was one of the most careful counters the service ever had. If he said the numbers were wrong, he meant something by it. I just don't know what. Harold Voss moved to Tucson, Arizona in December 1983. He never worked in wildlife management again. He took a job as a bookkeeper for a small construction company and lived quietly until his death from heart failure in 2004 at the age of 66. He granted only one interview about his time at Medicine Lake to a graduate student researching the history of the refuge system in 1997. The transcript, preserved in the University of Montana archives, contains a single exchange about the 1983 survey. I counted birds for 18 years, Voss said. I know how to count. I know what numbers look like when they're right, and I know what they look like when something's interfering with them. The student asked what he meant by interfering. I mean the numbers weren't stable, Voss replied. They changed. Not because the birds moved, because something about the counting itself was wrong, like the act of observing was being, noticed, adjusted for. I can't prove it. I couldn't prove it then. But I knew I couldn't keep doing it. I knew if I kept counting, I'd start seeing things that weren't meant to be seen. He declined to elaborate further. He asked that the interview not be published during his lifetime. Harold Voss's final survey report remains in the Fish and Wildlife Service archives filed under Medicine Lake NWR, Annual Census 1983. The first 12 pages contain detailed population data. The final 3 pages are blank except for a single sentence. The numbers are not what they appear to be. No one has ever determined what he meant. No one has ever explained what he saw. The birds still come to Medicine Lake every autumn. The surveys still continue. The numbers still get counted, tabulated, and submitted to regional offices. And somewhere in those numbers, if Harold Voss was right, something is watching, adjusting, counting back. The refuge keeps no record of rangers who requested transfers after working the annual census. But informally, among longtime staff, there is an understanding. Some people do well at Medicine Lake, and some people don't stay. The ones who don't stay rarely talk about why, and the ones who do stay learn, eventually, not to ask.